Presbyterians, some Presbyterians, have a real aversion to that thing called pledging. I'm not sure if it's our Scotch heritage or what. One pastor tried to get around that by working with his facilities chair and coming up with something a little different. He installed shockers in the seat of every pew. And he was prepared for that pledge Sunday when he stood up and he said, "Okay, and now I encourage everyone to stand up who will pledge at least $100 a month." And a few people stood up. And he said, "Okay, I encourage those who will pledge at least $250 a month to stand up." And he hit the buzzer. Suddenly people jumped up. But there were still plenty that hadn't gotten up yet. And so he hit it again, saying, "I hope that those who want to give $500 a month will stand up." And the thing was, though, they had said it so it would increasingly get stronger, thinking it might take a little extra juice. And finally he said, "I want to ask those who will pledge $1,000 a month to please stand up." And he hit the buzzer again, and there were a number of people coming up. And it looked like it was going to be a fantastic pledge Sunday at his congregation. And afterwards, in the office, they were counting things up. The ushers came back with the money with a sad look on their face. He said, "What's the matter?" They go, "Oh, we have the highest pledges we've ever received." "Well, that's wonderful." "No, you don't understand. There were three people that refused to get up, and they were electrocuted." Whether it's called Generosity Sunday, Pledge Sunday, or Stewardship Sunday, it's that time of the year that many people dread. Yes, the time of year when all of us are asked to make a pledge to this coming year's budget. Now, sometimes you receive a personal letter at home, sometimes it's shared in the monthly newsletter, or maybe you'll have a presentation like we'll have today. We're presented with a proposed budget and asked to make a pledge towards meeting that budget. Now, sometimes people make the mistake of seeing the budget and saying, "Oh, that's what we're going to be spending this year." Well, no, because your finance people are prudent. At least we like to think so. And they're also responsible, and they will adjust the budget if they have to based on what people give. And while we might find talk about pledging and budgets to be less than pleasant, to me, pledging, though, is something that is a natural thing to do as believers in Christ. How could the faithful not give a big thank you to God? We're supposed to whisper and sing expressions of gratitude to God. We're supposed to show joy in our worship and respond with care and compassion in the way we live. So how could we not also include part of our substance in returning what God has given us? Expressing gratefulness to God and sharing what we have with others are actually twin sides of the same coin of faith. And now this year, I would say that many of us feel that we're in okay economic shape. I've learned, however, not to make generalizations when it comes to finances. Stock market gyrations may have yo-yoed some people's retirement funds. Not everyone saw a benefit to the changes in the tax law. And depending on your circumstances, you may have a lower paying job this year than you had last year. But we are not in a Great Depression either. What we experience today, though, is nothing like what our ancestors went through. Up on the screen, you'll see a picture of 6 kernels of corn. Those pilgrims that landed in Plymouth Rock and celebrated, where we usually take, it's assumed, most of our Thanksgiving traditions from, that first year they had a very difficult time. In fact, many of them died. They hardly were able to harvest anything at all. But when they did finally experience a good harvest, they feasted. And now, of course, for us, feasting seems to be the main reason to celebrate Thanksgiving. But the pilgrims didn't feast blindly. They feasted, but they also remembered. They remembered that first year when food was so scarce. According to legend or history, whatever it is, it said that when they got to that very difficult time, the first year, they were down to, in the storehouse, just 6 grains of corn for each person that was there in the colony. 6 kernels of corn. But it was at that same time that the natives of the region came and brought them food, helped them to get through the winter. But can you imagine 5 or 6 kernels of corn? They don't amount to much. There's hardly anything to them at all. It might seem like there isn't enough there to amount to very much, but they knew something different. And their gratitude was not just for food, but also for their very lives. So today we have our own 6 kernels of corn, and I want you to keep those pictures in your mind and realize that each kernel today is going to represent a certain kind of giving. Because we believe there are 6 kinds of giving to the church, that each of us employs at least a couple of those types. The first kernel tells us of a kind of giving called responsibility giving. That's when people have a sense of responsibility toward the church and its mission and its programs. We're members, so we figure we ought to carry our share of the load. To keep the church doors open, there are a number of essential expenses that have to be met. And some of us call that paying dues. Now, if all things were as equal as the size of these grains of corn, it would be easy to tell you what our dues for 2019 would be. We'd simply take the budget, figure out the total, and divide it up by the number of members. The problem with that is, not all things are as equal as the size of those kernels of corn. For some of us, if we divided up everything equally between each person, it wouldn't be a problem at all. For some of us, it would be an extreme hardship. But that's not how we work. We give out of what we are able. And so the first kernel of corn reminds us that we're responsible to the church, and that giving responsibly is a good thing to do. If you want to call it paying dues, well, it is necessary to keep the doors open. And wanting to shoulder our share of the work is what members should do. Now, the second kind of giving is what I like to call good feeling giving. And it's simple. It's because when you give, you feel good. A lot of times folks give because there's a sense of gratification. Because when they give, they know they're helping to contribute to the work of Christ through the work of this congregation. And a lot of times that good feeling giving is private. You don't stand up and yell at everybody, "Hey, guess how much I gave this year?" I haven't seen too many Presbyterians ever do that. We don't publicize our feelings about giving or blow a trumpet to let everyone know, but there is something inside that feels good about being able to give, to be able to give to work, not just the church, but maybe it's charities or to universities, alma maters, whatever. Even though we don't announce it out loud, we know in our hearts what we've done, and it feels good. I think God wired us that way, to make us feel good when we do things for others. You may even get a special feeling if you've given sacrificially. Feeling good about giving is probably not at the top of the list of reasons people give, but there's no reason to put it down. It's not bad to feel good about doing something good. It's a natural thing. Maybe, as I said, God's reward to us for being generous. So the second kernel of corn is remind us of that kind of feeling good giving. The third kind is closely related, and I call that giving for a special cause. For example, many people feel most generous when they're giving to needy families at Christmas time, make a special contribution to disaster relief, or maybe they give something to the extra to the Salvation Army. Some of us give to United Way, to Habitat, maybe to the One Great Hour of Sharing, knowing that it goes all around the world. Some of that giving comes through the church, and some of it doesn't. But in each case, people feel a special connection because they've given to that specific cause that has touched their heart. Giving to a special cause is often the favorite way for many of us to give. It's easy to see why. You know exactly where your money's going, what it's going to help address, and that's important. It gives you a good feeling inside, so it's kind of like good feeling giving, but at the same time, it's a little stronger. Now, the first 3 kinds of giving I've talked about are interesting because it's kind of like the book of Esther in the Bible. You've never heard the word God said. I didn't mention God at all in any of those kinds of giving. It's just things we do, the things we think we have to do. Our motivations for giving those things are pretty much on a human level. God doesn't come into them, not explicitly or directly. Our understanding of God and God's requirements for discipleship may be part of it, but it's not really the primary reason behind this giving. It seems a little bit awkward, especially in a sermon, not to be mentioning God when you're talking about giving. So I want to talk about those three additional ways of giving. Different motivations in which God figures more directly. And number 4, there are examples of passages in Scripture where God specifically requires giving a portion of what we have, of what God has given to us. In Deuteronomy 26, there's a wonderful example. It says, when you've come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, and you possess it, and you settle in it, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And you shall put it in a basket, and go to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. And after that is followed a recital, a kind of Israelite creed, recalling everything God has done for them in delivering them and bringing them into the land. But there's a wonderful Presbyterian word in there. It's called shall. Anybody that studies the Book of Order knows that shall language is the stuff that we absolutely have to do. And this says, you shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, and you shall put it in a basket and bring it as an offering. That was required of every Israelite. It was not, and it would be real nice if some of you would bring me an offering from time to time, or I would appreciate it very much if you'd consider bringing something to the temple. It was a requirement. And later, after the Babylonian exile, when some Hebrews were neglecting that requirement, the prophet Malachi thundered, will anyone rob God? Yet you are robbing me, says the Lord. How? In your tithes and offerings, you're robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse. There's a requirement there, a demand, and some of this plays on a significant part of our attitude towards giving. We give because God requires it. It's called demand giving. And even though we Christians are not, as Paul says, under the law, but under grace, we still recognize God expects us to give. It's based on the recognition that all we have, we owe to God. God is the source of our life and all that supports our living. And we're caretakers of God's treasures with a responsibility to use all of God's treasures in accordance with God's will, and to use some of them directly for the purposes of doing the work of God's kingdom. And so that fourth kernel represents demand giving. Now, the recognition that all we have is a gift from God leads directly to another factor in our giving, which is simply this: gratitude. For many of us, our giving grows out of the gratitude for everything God has given us and done for us. I like to simply call that thanksgiving. Because in Deuteronomy 26, not only was there a requirement there, but there's also the reason for giving. And the reason is based on what God has done for them. Whenever they were to give at the temple of that year, they were to go through that recitation, not just as a form of worship leadership that they were supposed to do, but to remind them that God had really blessed them in ways that they had forgotten about. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now, because of this, out of gratitude for all of this, now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. How many of us really take time to consider that we believe that God has blessed us in our lives? Too often our American way is to sit there and say, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. That John Wayne attitude that says, I did it all on my own. No, you didn't. You didn't do very much in your life completely on your own. Along the way, if you really look, you'll find that there were people that helped lift you up or push you and give you some direction or gave you assistance when you needed it most, and that's what made the difference in your life. God has done the same for us. Some expressions go beyond that. Our cup overflows, as the psalmist says, and so gratitude then comes back in response. We've been loved, and so we love in return. We've received abundantly, and so we give abundantly. And so the fifth kernel of corn reminds us that thanksgiving is a distinctly Christian form of giving. But the sixth and last way of giving is similar to the thanksgiving, but maybe even a higher form. In today's reading from 2 Corinthians, Paul writes to a church in Corinth about their sister congregation in Macedonia. And this is really a strange phrase in a way. In today's reading, he wrote, "While they were being tested by many problems, their extra amount of happiness and their extreme poverty resulted in a surplus of rich generosity." Now, if that isn't the strangest combination I've ever heard, I don't know what is. Happiness and poverty together. Yay, I have nothing. How wonderful. In fact, I have less all the time. This is fantastic. But it results, as it says, in extra happiness and extra generosity. I like the New English Bible translation, maybe even a little better, when it said, "The troubles they've been through have tried them hard, yet in all this they've been so exuberantly happy that from the depths of their poverty they have shown themselves lavishly open-handed." Those expressions go beyond simply thanksgiving. And I bet if you had the chance to ask those Macedonian Christians all about their giving, I'm sure you discover that the exuberant giving came out of a deep sense of thanksgiving for everything, even the little bit that God had provided for them. But I don't think they ever stopped to examine their motivations. They didn't look for reasons to give generously. They just gave and did it with an abandon of joy. And so this final kind of giving we call joy giving. I learned about it personally from a friend of mine. He was the head chaplain where I was at my senior year of seminary. And he was from Kenya, and he explained to us that in their worship service, he found us Americans a little tight-fisted. And he couldn't believe our approach towards giving in church. He said, "You know, in our worship service, near the beginning of the service, there is an offering. And that's what we are expected to give and what we expect we should give. And so we do that. But then there's a second offering that takes place in the worship service later on, where we dance down the aisles, where we sing. And why? Because it's what we are giving out of our joy. It's because this isn't what we have to give. We're giving to God, the one who has blessed us, and we are giving back with joy so that the work of God can be done." How often have we taken that approach ourselves? Have we been joyful about giving? Most of the time it's a little, how can I fit that into the schedule? How can I fit that into the budget? But to give out of a sense of extreme joy and happiness just because you get to do it for God. When we reach that point, the exuberance of joy giving, then the very way we live becomes gospel. And it's good news not only to ourselves, but to everyone around us. Because in joy, we participate in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the grace of God. Because it means we are thrilled to have an opportunity to be part of serving one another, to helping other people. 6 kernels of corn to remind us of 6 kinds of giving. 6 kernels of corn, as I said, don't look like much. A kernel of corn isn't much of anything when you think about it. What is it? I don't think I could get much sustenance off of that. But yet within each kernel of corn there is a seed of life. And I think the same is true of the way we give. Sometimes we don't think our giving, our pledges amount to much, but I will tell you this, they do provide life. Life for this congregation and a continued life of Jesus Christ in the community around us. Pledging is more than a gift for the church. It is life itself in some ways. Perhaps that's the reason why God instructed us to share what we have. So as you consider your giving for next year, pledge to do more than one style of giving. And if you're lucky enough, maybe you may actually get all the way to joy giving. And then together we can call Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church a place filled with the joy of God's love. May God bless us.